Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our latest installment of the Rugby Canada webinar series presented by DHL. Rugby Canada would like to thank a lot of our sponsors, but especially DHL for being supportive during this pandemic period. Rugby Canada is not immune to some of the hardships that have befallen much of society, and so without some of the support of our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to deliver some of the programs that we are able to even now. So we want to thank DHL for their help in helping us put this on. Before I get into introducing our guest tonight, Miss Jennifer Smart, who I've had the pleasure of knowing my entire 7 years now at Rugby Canada for me. It's been longer for you, but we'll get to that in a second. I just want to say welcome again. Tonight we are going to discuss running a successful event or successful rugby event. And Jen will run through, what the tips and tricks of the trade are. Before we get to that, I just want to remind people of how to work your GoToWebinar control panel. So you will have a questions box, and I will be sorting through those questions as we go through. Jen has about a 45 minute presentation, and then it might stretch a little bit longer, but we'll get as many of your questions as we possibly can in today. Please note we're just going to try and mush similar questions together and then try and come up with the most bang for our buck as we spend the next hour here with Jen. In addition to that, we have our previous webinars up on the Rugby Canada YouTube page, and then once we're done tonight, tomorrow, we'll have this video uploaded as well. So for anyone who needs to go back and check on some of our previous ones, you can join us there. Welcome, Jennifer. Jennifer and I have had a long relationship now. We've gotten to run quite a few events together. Jennifer started as an intern at Rugby Canada way back when and has moved all the way up to running events now at the last 2 World Cups, and most notably in 2019 at the Rugby World Cup in Japan, getting to run some events at Tokyo Stadium and taking care of 2 quarterfinals and the bronze match, if I'm not mistaken. I'll let Jennifer run through a little bit more of her bio, but otherwise, yeah, let's get to it. Jen, all you.
Thanks, Nathan, for that lovely introduction. Yeah, so as Nathan said, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Smart, and I am the current director of events at Rugby Canada. I started out at Rugby Canada as an intern right out of school, and have been here for over 13 years now, worked my way up to my current position. As director of events, it's my responsibility to ensure that all of our home games and tournaments are delivered at to a high quality and standard, and that they're done professionally. And I work on developing our hosting strategy, identifying hosting opportunities, and I'm responsible for integrating and collaborating with other departments throughout the whole event planning process for each of our games and tournaments. I've delivered over 200 events with Rugby Canada, varying in scope and from coast to coast in lots of different types of venues. And as Nathan mentioned, I've had incredible opportunities outside of Rugby Canada as well to help out on a couple different Rugby World Cups and the Pan Am Games. So what I'd like to do tonight is just go through some tips, talk about kind of how you get started when you have an event that you're going to host, what things you need to do first. I'll share some resources with you, and then maybe focus in on a couple areas that I feel are important and sometimes overlooked. So that's all about me. So why don't we jump right in? Flip there. So the first step, so when you have an event, first thing you're going to want to do is clearly define what is the event that you're about to host. So, this is your who, what, where, and when. So is it a tournament over several days? Is it a single match over a few hours? How many teams are participating? and as well get a clear understanding of what the required deliverables are, and your minimum standards for hosting that event. So a lot of our tournaments or games are a part of a World Rugby tournament, and so we would receive a host union agreement or a terms of participation document, or a tour agreement that outlines all of those things that we're supposed to provide. For instance, are you responsible for booking accommodations? Are you responsible for providing any meals? Do you make the match official appointments? So these are all things that you'll want to know and kind of define all the details and parameters that you need to deliver on. So once you know what you're delivering, then you need to understand why you're hosting the event. So knowing what your purpose in hosting or your objective is will help you focus your resources, and kind of be your guiding compass when you're making decisions, and that will help you achieve your goals. So examples of what your objective or your purpose for hosting might be could be to generate revenue and fundraise. It could be to provide quality competition or development opportunities for a particular team. It could be to encourage mass participation in the sport of rugby, or to create sort of a greater bond or team building opportunity within your community. So first off, the what, then the why, and kind of understanding what is your major objective. You might say that you want to achieve lots of different things. You have lots of goals and objectives with in hosting an event, but it is super important that you identify which one is your top priority, because again, that will help you to focus and really will guide your decision making. So just as an example, in 2016, we hosted the Italian men's team in Toronto at BMO Field for a match, and we decided in advance that the purpose of hosting, while certainly there were high performance reasons, we want to have quality competition against a tier 1 nation, the priority or the main objective was to use that match as a revenue generation opportunity. So when we were looking at, where are we going to place the teams throughout the week and in which hotels, we found hotels outside of the city of Toronto that were nice and close to the training venues, and were at a lesser rate than downtown properties. We looked at the idea, which we have done in the past, at moving teams maybe a day or two before the match into a downtown hotel so that they're nice and close to the match venue. It cuts down on travel time. However, in this instance, the rates were so high compared to what we were looking at generating in revenue that we decided against it, because revenue generation was our primary objective. So we kept teams out in the hotels that were just outside the city. They had a little bit of a longer way to travel into the match venue, but ultimately that helped us in achieving our primary goal. So in addition to understanding your what you're doing and why you're doing it, you're going to want to make sure that you can clearly communicate that to to everyone involved in the event. And one of the ways to document and make sure everyone is on the same page is to create an event brief. So an event brief is a super simple summary of your event that does exactly that. It outlines your where, what, when, how, and why. So your event name, your dates, all these details. Your objective is basically your purpose, and then how you're going to measure that success, and then you can include any other important details, because that might vary from event to event. The idea, though, is to make sure that you're keeping it simple, clear, and concise, so that everyone reading it can easily understand what you're trying to achieve and what the event is all about. And to keep it short and sweet. You don't want people who are reading this to have to invest a lot of time into reading it. 1 or 2 page summary, just to give them a general idea of what's going on, is perfect. And then this will form the foundation or the building blocks from which you'll plan the event. Okay. Any is there any questions on that bit, Nathan?
Not at the moment. Some people might be just finishing off their thoughts. So we can always come back to this section, Jen, if you want to continue on, and then we'll make sure that we address some of those questions at the end when we have a little bit more time and people have formulated some ideas.
Yeah, no worries. All right. So we will continue on then. So now that you know what you're delivering and why you're delivering it, it's a good time to start pulling together your organizing committee. So this is the group of people who are going to help you with the detailed planning and the execution of your event. There's no real cookie cutter way or standard format with which to pull together your organizing committee or how to structure your organizing committee. The important thing is to make sure that you're not missing any gaps. So the best way to achieve that is to really outline what are all the different elements of your event. So here you'll see the different functional areas that we use when we're planning our major events. Your event that you're doing might not encompass all of this, or they might have variations of this where you don't maybe go as in depth, or there could be things that we don't do that are part of your event. So it's really up to you to kind of take that event brief that you've done and understand what are the different areas you're going to deliver on. So briefly here, we're looking at finance and admin as one area, logistics. So this is kind of your travel, your shipping, your storage, team services, which we'll touch on a little later, event operations, a lot to do with the match venue. Your game presentation and fan experience is more about that entertainment aspect. The ticketing, suites, and hospitality, pretty straightforward. Ticket pricing, sales, accreditation might fall under here. VIP hosting might fall under here. Marketing, communications, commercials, that's all the other revenue generating things. Event sponsorship could fall under here. Merchandising and retail. Volunteers, your match services, which are more about the integrity of the game. Field of play would fall under here. Match official services. And then, of course, medical, welfare, and safety for the event, and then any legacy or community engagement items. So these are the functional areas that we use that are overarching, and again, it's up to you to kind of define what are the functional areas that are relevant for your event. And then when you're pulling together your organizing committee to execute or plan around all of these areas, it's important to look at, what are the capacities or how involved is each one of these areas? Can one person, for instance, oversee and lead on multiple areas? Or perhaps there's an area that, they can only really be involved in that one because it's so in depth. So as you kind of map out what your functional areas are, also try and understand what the scope is and how involved those areas are going to be. And then generally speaking, when you're actually going and recruiting people to be a part of your committee and oversee all these areas, while there might not be a cookie cutter way in how you structure your organizing committee, I'd say there's a pretty clear type of person that you're trying to bring on. So you want someone or people on your team who are going to be committed and reliable, people who are organized, that work well with others, that don't think that they know everything and are willing to adapt and will learn from those around them, and perhaps they have an expertise in a particular area, and then of course that they have the ability and the capacity to be a part of the committee. And don't be afraid to think outside the box. Like if there's someone who has an expertise or has knowledge around something that you think would be really beneficial for your committee, but they're not going to have the time or ability to commit to being a part of the organizing team, maybe you bring them on board in an advisory capacity. So find the best structure that works for you. Make sure you're covering all your bases and that all the different functional areas have someone to lead them and take over the planning for that area. And yeah, a group of people that's really going to help you deliver the best possible event. People that you can work with, and personalities are definitely a big thing you have to be able to manage. All right. So now that we've identified the functional areas, one thing we're going to want to put together is the project plan and critical path, as well as really nailing down the roles and responsibilities for that group. And I have a couple resources that I use to do this that I find incredibly helpful, and I recommend starting with the critical path or project plan. So this document basically allows you and your organizing group to stay on task, to see how things are progressing, enables you to stick to timelines and identify any potential problem areas. So you'll see in this example, you know, I've shown at the top the way you would, or the way I would structure the critical path, with kind of your functional area or your heading, and then all the tasks that need to be completed under that area. Then it shows who's assigned to that particular task. There's a column where they can update the progress and where they're at with that task, when that task should be started, and then, of course, your target date for completion. Then over on the right, you'll see there's a Gantt chart, or it's basically a visual timeline for the task. And not only does it show you, how long each particular task might take, but it also can help you identify really busy times when someone might be flat out because they have multiple tasks that they're managing at once. And then that would be an area where you can identify that person might need some support. This particular program that I use for critical path is called Smart Sheets. Basically, I like the functionality of it and all the different things you can do with it. So we have, when, for instance, you can see under logistics, the transportation plan had a target due date of April 17th, we'll say, and because it's not yet marked as complete, Smart Sheets automatically has identified that that is overdue and highlighted it in red, since it still says in progress and not yet complete. And it does created a logic where it will do that automatically. Same thing when you mark something complete, it automatically goes green. So I like the different functionalities of it. It'll also email people when a task has been assigned to them, or when a due date is approaching. So it's a really great tool. Now, with that said, your event might not have the budget to be able to subscribe to something like Smart Sheets with all that functionality, and that's completely fine. You can easily create a critical path or project plan that in Excel on your own. The key thing that I would like to stress is that you're going to want to make sure that it's something that you can update in real time, and that everyone has access to. So if you can put it on a shared drive, like a Google document or a OneDrive document, then that would be ideal, so that you don't end up with multiple copies with different people that are only partially updated. This way, everyone's working off the same live document, and you know that it's the most up to date. So going hand in hand with the critical path is what I like to call roles and responsibilities matrix. This is just essentially exactly what it sounds like, a summary of what is the task, what's involved with completing that task, who's it's assigned to. I also use this document to show relationships. So if you have more than one person or more than one group that you're working with to complete a particular task, you can actually differentiate what one person does for that task versus another. So in this instance, I've identified what Rugby Canada staff members, event staff members are responsible for completing with regards to a particular task, and then how that differs from what the local organizing group responsible for that task might be doing. So you can see, for instance, under transportation plan, I'm listed as a staff member, and I'm responsible for creating a transportation plan for teams, VIPs, event staff, and officials while they're on the ground. Whereas the local committee is responsible for the transportation plan for fans and volunteers around match day. And that could include a parking plan, for instance. So that's just an example. And normally, I will say, I typically have this side by side. So you would see the local organizing committee name and role right beside in the same row as the Rugby Canada name and role description. But just to fit it all on the slide, I've stacked them here. Okay, and then again, just making sure that you're cross-referencing, or when you're working with the critical path, that you're including all the tasks, whether it's local organizing committee or an outside group. Okay. Then lastly, in terms of first steps and things that you want to be doing before you dive into the detailed planning, is actually your budget. Not surprisingly, I'm sure there's some people out there who thought I might have forgotten about it. And you absolutely can do your budget before you recruit your organizing committee and create your critical path and that. I just find that sometimes it can be easier and more efficient to do the budget along with members of your organizing group. They can help with securing quotes and pricing on things. They might know the local market where your event is being hosted better. Certainly this applies for us. I'm located in Toronto, but I'm working with groups in Winnipeg or Calgary. So they know their market better. They might have connections to suppliers. So I find it really beneficial to go through a budgeting process with those groups if I can. So when you're creating your budget, you'll also want to think back on your event brief and your what and your why, so that can kind of, again, guide you, particularly when you're putting numbers to your expenses, where you're going to be spending your money. So just keeping that in mind when you're going through that process. This is a template of a budget. So the first thing you're obviously going to want to do is create your different line items or categories. So what sources of revenue are you expecting? And then, of course, what expenses are you anticipating incurring based on what you have to deliver? I would really recommend that you be conservative in your revenues. It's always better to overperform than to end up under in your revenue targets. And then for expenses, I definitely recommend that if you're not familiar with what something might cost, go out and get quotes and get multiple quotes, or consult someone who does have experience with that particular item, so that you can be as realistic with your numbers as possible. And again, wherever you can, you'll notice the last line item of this example is a contingency. Build in that little buffer in case things come up, or something is off in your expenses when you're budgeting. So then the line items I've listed here might not apply to every event. This is just a standard template that I'm using for my major events, but you might not have broadcast and streaming, so that expense item can come right out. In revenues, maybe you're not doing hospitality and suites, so just take that out. So you obviously just decide what line items, what categories of revenue and expenses work for your event, and line up with your different functional areas and what they might need to spend, or what revenues they might be able to bring in. And yeah, so set it up to what meets your needs. The other piece to this, and something that can sometimes be forgotten about, is to set up what I would call a forecast budget, or a forecast profit and loss. So it should be the exact same template as this budget, as your original budget that you finalized, but it is also a living and breathing document, something that you continue to update. As like if you're selling tickets to your event, as ticket sales are going on, seeing the trend, and are you on track to hit what you budgeted for? If not, you need to readjust what you think that revenue is going to end up at. Same with expenses. As you sign off on contracts, or book a supplier who might be providing something for your event, then and those costs become more firm, fill those in on your forecast budget. This just allows you to get a handle on how you're performing versus how you anticipate, like how you budgeted. So this is a financial measure of success and progress. It's something that you'll want to update regularly as information becomes available. And if revenues are really not trending the way that you anticipated, doing this regularly, updating your forecast regularly, allows you to see that and potentially scale back on some of your expenses in order to meet your bottom line for the budget. I'll maybe stop there. Nathan, is there any questions?
Yeah, we've had a couple of things come up just because we're already talking about budget. Do you have a recommendation for a contingency amount, whether that's a percentage or a dollar amount?
It depends on the event, but yeah, generally, I think for smaller events, somewhere around that, 5% works. For larger events, you might try and have 10% if you can. It's really going to be dictated by what you're able to achieve, like what your bottom line, what you want your bottom line to be versus what you absolutely have to deliver, and what you estimate that costing. But by 5 to 10% is a really good number I have found.
Okay. And then it might be difficult to answer this in some circumstances, but what about going over budget? And is there how does that system work when it comes to maybe approvals, or is it just a matter of there's a hard number that we can't go over, and then do we need to find other solutions? How does going over budget, how does that fit into your planning?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the reasons why forecasting and revisiting where you're at financially is really important, because then whoever is managing the budget and seeing that can actually identify that, oh, we've gone way over budget here. But then another area might actually be under budget. So coming together with your group and really looking at those financials regularly. It doesn't have to be a super in-depth meeting, but just having a touch base will show you. And if they're, everyone's sort of on budget and then there is something that's over, or if everyone's kind of over budget, then that's a decision you have to make. And again, that can go back to your purpose. So if the purpose of your event isn't to make money, then it's up to your group, and whether you leave this to the chair of your committee, whoever is ultimately in charge, or to you decide as a group what level of investment you're willing to make. So, for instance, looking at the America's Rugby Championship, there are games that they're not, the purpose of those events is not revenue generation. With that said, we obviously don't want to lose money if we don't have to, so financial responsibility is important. However, more important is making sure that, one, we're delivering minimum standards, and two, that our team is participating in that tournament. So if I see that we're going to be over budget in a certain area, or how much we're going to lose, I communicate that regularly, where we're at, where we're forecasting, to our senior leadership, and it would be up to them, and they might consult me as to whether we carry on. And because we participated in the particular year that I'm thinking of, we participated in that more out of performance priority, then that's something that we would bring performance staff, whether it's Dustin Hopkins or Kingsley Jones, into that conversation around, whether we move forward with hosting, what we can cut. I might have to speak with the tournament organizer around not being able to meet a particular minimum standard, and we'd have a discussion on that. But ultimately, you have to decide what you're willing to invest into that event. Does
That's
that
great.
answer?
Yeah, no, it's great. No, so there's a couple of questions, but I'm gonna pick them up again when we get to the end. They'll be relevant around the planning process early on in your planning process. Just a reminder, there's been a couple of questions as well about the availability of slides. Jennifer will graciously put her email up at the end of this and allow people to get in touch with her for some resources directly and have further conversations. So I'll wait till the end for that. But Jen, why don't we move on to your next piece, and I'll make sure we touch on some of these other questions by the end.
Yeah, sure. So I provided a lot of sort of pre-planning resources, and I think the overarching theme that hopefully you're picking up is that being organization is key. It really is the foundation for success in event management. And there's lots of different ways to stay organized. So you can kind of pick and choose what's going to really work for you and your group. You'll see one of my favorite ways to stay organized is actually your traditional checklist. So you'll see on the left here is a photograph of part of one of my checklists for a day before a game. This was from the 2019 Rugby World Cup. And it's literally on the whiteboard, just a checklist of everything that I wanted to make sure myself and my team got through and completed that day before leaving. On the right, you'll see my little workspace and my clipboard. A clipboard was much more detailed. It also included a lot of timings against some of these. So that's something I would carry around with me as we're doing things. But I really like the checklist. I really like visually being able to see what needs to get done and see that it has been done. You'll notice I don't have things wiped off the board. We actually check them so that it doesn't get forgotten, and I can actually, when I come back to the board, see that, oh, so and so has completed that task. So that's one of the ways that I like to work. So it's really about finding what works for you. There's certainly a lot of my colleagues who are in the exact same role as me at the World Cup. We're potentially not using checklists at all. They just stuck with whatever organizational tool worked for them. So just key is to stay organized. And then I've listed kind of some of the resources we've talked about, as well as a couple that I'm going to get to in a moment. So a couple more resources that I find particularly helpful. They're not so much in the how you get started planning. These are more the nitty-gritty of planning. So one of your most important spaces or areas is your event operations, and in particular your event venue or your match venue. The venue is your platform from which you're going to showcase the event. So it really needs to be well thought out and well planned around all the different operational spaces and how you're going to utilize the space at the venue. So I like to use a chart that lists all the different areas for event that we might need for the event to use at the match venue. You'll see the second column there is a space where I can actually fill in what space or room at the venue is going to be used to fulfill that area. And then all the subsequent columns list the different setup requirements or needs. And these might change from event to event, but this is a kind of standard. And obviously it's incomplete. I do have the larger one, but again, I just wanted this to be visible on the slide. So kind of showing the top end of the chart here. Tables and chairs are things that often we need to rent. So I've given them their own column so that we can really see how many tables and how many chairs are needed across the whole venue. And then other setup requirements: does that space require power? Does it require internet? And then any other notes that might be relevant. And this is a great tool because it can also be used as a checklist. So you might be the person planning how these spaces are allocated and how they're set up. But if you have a chart like this, then you can actually use this to hand off to someone else to actually go and physically check that that space is set up the way it's supposed to be. I know at other tournaments, including the World Cup, we've the logistics team has actually put a list or a chart right on the door of each space of what needs to be in that room, which makes it nice and super simple for you to see what fittings and fixtures should be in there, and to double check that it is accurate and correct. So something like this is, I find, super helpful, and then it's easily communicated to other people who can then assist in the actual setup. Next, I have a run sheet. So a run sheet is something that outlines all of your day of game timings. This particular example is from the World Cup this past year. You can see it's very detailed, and it's actually counted right down to the second. Your event might not need a run sheet that's quite so specific, but I do think having a run of show or a schedule of events is super helpful for any event. When you are sticking to your times, it just helps you be reassured that everything is going the way it should be. It also, when you create these run sheets, it helps you get a better understanding of what the flow of your event is going to be. And again, identifying some areas where certain pieces might need more support. So for instance, if you know your ball team needs to be in position around the pitch at a certain time, but the person responsible for ball team is also helping make sure that the team's equipment's brought into the change room, and those times overlap, then maybe you need to bring in someone else to support. So it's really good in that respect to have some kind of schedule or run order. I find, at least at the events that we have, certainly the teams appreciate having these timings, and they'll often take the timings we give them for the match and create their own team run sheet as well. So it's definitely a really great tool to use to ensure that your event runs as smoothly as possible. You also have to understand that any kind of delay or things going off early or late, doesn't matter, can have an implication or a negative impact on the event overall. Whether it's a high level event where there's broadcast involved and they need to have enough time for their commercial break, right down to a family who's planned their day to get to an event at a certain time for kickoff. If you've gone early and they're not in the door yet, but according to them, they're on time, that just leaves a bad taste in their mouth. So that's just a small example of how important it can be. Another example is if you're running a tournament and you're not really concerned with the timings that the games are going off. Maybe you have a scorekeeper who's on one field and they're supposed to be doing a game on a completely different field next, but that game started early, and now you're scrambling to try and find someone to keep track of the score on that field. So just things like that, if you're sticking to your schedule, sticking to your timings, can really help things go smoothly, and it adds that feeling of professionalism and integrity to your event. Next, I kind of wanted to shift focus a bit. I've given you a lot of tools, a lot of ways to stay organized, and to resources to help plan through your event. So I wanted to kind of take some time to focus on a few areas that are really important or can sometimes be overlooked. Before I move on to that, are there any questions, Nathan, that you wanted to throw in now?
Are you going to touch on, I know in our conversations prior to, I think you mentioned you would touch on some volunteer pieces.
Yes, that's next.
Okay, so I'll hold off on that question because you will probably answer it. No, everything else right now is again related to the stuff that you really started out with. So we'll come back to that again at the end.
Perfect. Okay, so as I just mentioned, I wanted to talk or focus on volunteers. Volunteers is such a big part of your event. They are usually, the largest bit of your workforce. At least for our events, they certainly are. So I wanted to start with volunteer recruitment and how you might go about that. One thing I find particularly helpful is to have a dedicated volunteer lead or a volunteer manager, whether this is a member of your committee or whether you have another key volunteer who reports to that person. Doesn't matter, but I do find having a lead who is the person communicating with your volunteers and helping to organize their orientation or training, and put in their t-shirt orders or whatever. That person is really great to have on board and to make sure that your volunteers are looked after. I also find in recruiting volunteers, people tend to stick to their own networks, so they're looking for volunteers within their rugby club or within their community that's helping them host the event, which is great. And you definitely want to have key volunteers who you know and you can rely on, like I said, but don't limit yourself just to your own networks. Take a look outside and of that as well. And ways you can do that is, is there other sporting organizations or clubs in your area that you can tap into? For instance, there might be a local soccer club or a group of people who volunteer for at games for your local CFL team, or whatever the case might be. Just any other community sport. They often have people who are really willing to just get involved in the community and participate and who might help you out. You can also look at contacting event organizers of other events that have previously been held in your community, and tap into their volunteer bases, the group of people who volunteered for them. The other plus of that is they have volunteering experience. And then another resource to look at is high schools and colleges. Their students have to complete a certain number of community service hours or volunteer hours. So there's a workforce right there that's willing and eager, and often working at an event is really appealing for them compared to some of the other volunteer community service things they might have lined up. So definitely look at that, and you might benefit from that as well. Typically, if you're hosting a rugby event, it's rugby people, your rugby community that's going to want to come to that event. And, while it's great to have them involved in the planning, you also want them to be able to come to the event and enjoy it or buy a ticket. And if they're volunteering, they can't do that. So when you're looking outside to other networks, then you're opening up room for your own community to enjoy the event that you're putting on. The other key thing for volunteer recruitment is in the recruitment process, you're going to want to have already defined how many volunteers you need, what are the roles that they're filling. So here you can see an example of a volunteer assignment chart that I use, and it's great because as much as not having enough volunteers can be stressful and detrimental, having too many volunteers can also be a bad thing. While you don't want to be turning people away, especially if you might want to engage with them moving forward, you do need to think about what your actual needs are, and having some buffer is good, but having way too many means that you're going to have volunteers who don't have a job, who are just sitting around, and that's not fun for them, especially when they've taken time out of their schedules and their lives to be helpful. And also if they're just standing around or sitting around in a publicly visible area, it doesn't look great either from a public perspective. So one of the things you can do is, if you are experiencing that wonderful problem of having more volunteers than you need, is to either create a wait list, so you can inform volunteers who signed up after you've already had reached your limit, that should anyone cancel or should something come up, that they would be the first group that you call to see if they're still available to come and help. Another thing that you can do is, depending on your event, the length of your event, you could look at creating shifts and do some rolling shifts to make sure that you're actually utilizing all the people who have signed up. And then lastly is just, when you're recruiting people and when they're signing up, is make sure you're collecting all the important info. So not just their name, contact information, and t-shirt size, but also make sure you have an emergency contact information for them, that if they have any allergies, particularly food allergies or dietary restrictions. Other things you might want to consider asking them about as well is their experience. Knowing what their skill set is can really help you to allocate roles and get the best out of your volunteers. And then also preferences. Not that you don't want them to assign themselves to roles necessarily, but knowing what they really are interested in, or what they absolutely are not interested in, can also help you and make things easier in terms of assigning people to their roles. Which leads me into volunteer experience. Again, I mentioned that the volunteers are typically the largest part of your workforce. They definitely are for our events. And they're often the first interaction that a fan will have with your event. So that old saying, you only get one chance to make a first impression, is incredibly true, and your volunteers are a big part of that. So you want to make sure that they're happy and that they're confident and they're having a good time. And their experience is good, because a happy worker is a productive worker, and their positivity will hopefully translate into happy experiences for fans. So some of the ways that you can help to make sure that your volunteer experience is good is to make sure that you are properly training your volunteers and you're empowering them. Take the time to really make sure that they know what their role is, they know how to execute it. So holding an orientation in the lead up to, you can even do it on the event day, pending the scope of your event and how many volunteers you have. You could look at doing it early in the day, ahead of them arriving. But yeah, if you can do it in advance with your group, have an orientation, a chance to explain their role to them, allow them to ask questions, and yeah, just really make sure that they're comfortable. If you can do it at the event venue, at the match venue, that's even better, because then you can give them a tour of the spaces they're going to be working in and they can get familiar with that environment. Other thing you want to do is you want to support your volunteers by providing them with all the information and resources that they might need, so to do their jobs. So whether that's making sure they know where the washrooms are located, providing them with a seating map, or your tournament match schedule. If they're working up by the entrance and exit points, it would be good for them to know, what are your re-entry policies? Are they allowed to leave and come back? Or once they're in, are they in? You also want to make sure your volunteers are very aware of who they need to go to if they have any issues or questions throughout the day. So just arming them with all the relevant information so that they can do their goals, that their job, and that they're comfortable in their job, and they know who to go to for support is incredibly important and can make a lot of difference. Taking care and appreciating your volunteers. So this is a big piece of where your volunteer lead or manager will come in. So in addition to just doing all the admin of checking in your volunteers, distributing their t-shirts, assigning them to their roles and sending them out, the volunteer lead can go around and make sure that every volunteer, if they, depending on how long your days are, maybe they need a break, and that they're getting that break, they're staying hydrated. If it's a really hot day, hydration is super important. I mean, it's important anytime, but particularly, you're going to want to be vigilant about that if it's a hot, sunny day and they're outside. Taking time to, when you're checking in on them, to make sure that they're okay, that they're doing well in their jobs, thanking them throughout the day, letting them know what a great job they're doing. If they, if someone's standing out, tell them so. Those are all ways that you can show appreciation and take care of your volunteers. One of the most common ways to appreciate a volunteer is by giving them a gift. Not all budgets, have that in it. So that's something that you wish you could do, but you just don't. There are other really cost effective, don't even cost anything in some cases, ways that you can show appreciation for your volunteers. Something as simple as making sure that they have a t-shirt that fits them properly, and that they're comfortable in. So when you put in your volunteer t-shirt order, I know you've already requested everyone's size, but don't order just that. Have a little bit of a buffer in the different sizes, so that if someone over or underestimated how their size and how it's going to fit, you can give them a replacement t-shirt. You can switch it out with something that they're going to be more comfortable in. Again, having decent food. So if you're providing, again, depending on the length of your day, if you're providing a meal or a snack, having decent food to give them is another way to show appreciation. And then something so simple, after the event, you can send them a thank you letter, a personalized letter, whether it's an email or an actual letter that you're going to pop in the mail. That's a pretty easy way, and it's actually a more sentimental way, and to show your appreciation and make them feel valued. And then also, when the event is over, you're going to want to follow up with them, not just to say thank you, although that is important, but to get some feedback. So I highly recommend asking for input on, what went well, what didn't, and perhaps some ideas for improvement. So a simple, stop, start, continue. What should we stop doing because it just didn't really work? What should we start doing because it would, and because you have ideas for improvement, and what should we continue doing because it was done really well. You'll probably get really interesting and useful feedback. So not only will they feel valued and hopefully have had a good time now, but you'll hopefully have learned ways that you can even improve that for next time.
Jen, I think those are all fantastic tips and tricks. Getting conscious of time a little bit, I just want to make sure we address some of the questions that have come up, because we're going to try and tie a couple things together. But do you mind if I take it back to the beginning when you were talking about your setup and your committee piece? First of all, as an organization, when we look at what the priority of the event is, who's a part of that decision-making process? Is it solely one side of the organization or another, and who maybe has final say around some of that?
No, it's something that we try and discuss. So I had mentioned, at the very top, part of my role is to integrate with and collaborate with other departments. So it's looking at, what is the event, who's involved in the event, and what are the opportunities around it. So we always get input from the performance side to see, how important is this event to them, what are their goals and objectives, and then weigh it against the commercial side as well, and what opportunities might be there. A lot of it might also have to do with what other games and events we have on that season or that year, to help achieve some of the goals. So if we have a couple other events that are going to be, top priority for revenue generation or good opportunities for revenue generation, then maybe it's not such a massive priority for this one particular event if there are some other overarching performance details, and vice versa. So we do that a bit collaboratively, and then ultimately it would be the executive leadership team at Rugby Canada who would approve and finalize kind of our budgets and our priorities.
Awesome. You spoke at length about an organizing committee. I'm assuming most of those committees are volunteer-based. So how do you go about delineating roles and responsibilities and holding people to account for the delivery on those commitments?
Yeah, so that's something where the roles and responsibilities matrix can be really handy. So I always start with a template of this is what we would like to happen. And then I actually send that to the committee for feedback and review. So I like them to tell me, to identify areas where they don't think that's maybe an area where they want to be involved in or have the capacity to be involved in, and then we can work that out, and that's something then I'll work with them. So at the end of it, the roles and responsibilities matrix for every event is going to be different because every committee is different, and their ability, their expertise, and their capacity and time commitment might be different because of that. So it's really working on that, and you have to look at capacities generally in terms of you might need to scale some things back, scale some plans back if the committee doesn't have capacity and you and your staff don't have capacity. Then that just means you're going to have to downscale what you're delivering.
No, that's a great point. This next piece actually might tie in a couple parts around the volunteer piece. You have a volunteer organizing committee. You have volunteers on the day or during the weekend event or however that event is structured. What would be the approximate number for, let's say, an organizing committee, and for on-field, if it's a 15s or 7s event, for on-field help, for one, and two, what are some things you do to help with manage contingencies in case of attrition? So volunteers not being able to follow through on commitments, something comes up, we need to make a change, and having lost volunteer capacity.
Right, okay. So in terms of organizing committee and numbers, that really depends. I mean, we've worked with organizing committees on games that are, only 3 or 4 people working with our staff, and then I've also worked with committees of 10 people, which again just comes down to what they're able to deliver on and how our working relationship will change based on that. So that can really change, and I find both to be very effective, as long as you define what the roles and responsibilities are. In terms of volunteers and numbers, I think dealing with volunteers not showing up, that's why I always think it is good to have a bit of a buffer. Those people won't necessarily just be sitting around doing nothing. Say if all the volunteers show up, then you can look at using them to relieve people for breaks, or you can always find a role for a few people. So I would definitely have a bit of a buffer. Depends on how many volunteers you need for across the whole event. Your buffer could be, only 4 or 5 volunteers, or it could be 10 or 12. I wouldn't say you'd want any more than that, and it just depends on the scale of your event and how many volunteer roles you have.
Absolutely. Jen, I know event management at the top level has a lot of player welfare considerations. For those who are running community events, how does player welfare fit into what they might need to take into account when they plan for their budget, medical needs, and the potential for delays, provided injuries and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's all right, I'll just skip ahead to that slide quickly. So welfare and safety, I think a lot of events just, their plan is we're going to call 911 because the hospital or the dispatch for the ambulance is not very far, and that's sort of the action plan. But you really do need to have an actual emergency action plan around, how is it going to be activated, who makes that decision, who's calling 911. So if that is your plan, then that's fine. And that might be the minimum standard, but I definitely challenge you to look at ways that you can add to that medical welfare and safety in order to ensure that is, a bigger priority. I think it's something that can sometimes be left behind, not because we're not conscious of it, but because there's just so much going on. Event management is such a big place. So you really do need to make a conscious effort to look at what else you can do within your budget. And, things like inspecting the field of play. Is there debris on the field? Are there divots that might be dangerous? Are there tripping hazards around the field of play that might impact teams or perhaps even spectators? Cleanliness. Do you have a proper space or somewhere that teams can go to do a cool down or a warm up if they can't do it on the field? Just things like that. In terms of actual medical services, I think it's important to understand what teams are bringing. So if they have any medical staff that are coming, and having them connect with whoever's going to be in charge of your medical services so that everyone's on the same page in advance of protocols, of signals. Typically, at least for events that I've run, the team therapist or doctor is going to be the charge person. They're going to be the one who initially takes control of the situation and assesses whether there's further medical attention or an extraction that needs to take place. But how do they signal to your event medical staff or medical lead, to actually get them that assistance or call for the ambulance, or whatever it might be. The other piece is spectator safety. I find sometimes that gets overlooked, and you think, and it's a last minute, oh shoot, what are we going to do if spectators are ill or need some medical assistance? A great resource is St. John's Ambulance. I use them across almost all of our events to help with fan first aid and spectator first aid.
Outstanding. Jen, you and I spoke before tonight. There's a whole other range of things that we could discuss. Player welfare, of course, being our primary concern at these events. Unfortunately, we just run out of time. I'm just going to do a quick little wrap up, and then Jen, if you don't mind throwing up your slide with your email address for us so people can get in touch. I want to thank everyone for your time and for joining us tonight. Jennifer put a lot of effort into this, and I thought she did a great job of showing us, what are the key aspects we need to make sure we can run a successful event. She's happy to follow up with anyone. Her email is there, jsmart@rugby.ca for content requirements. Please note we are still under rugby in-person participation suspension at the moment. The next update from Rugby Canada will be no later than June 30th, though I expect we might be hearing from either the national body or provincial unions, depending on where you live, before that. So just keep your ears peeled. Please note, this coming Thursday, we have François Ratier en français qui va discuter la culture de l'équipe envers la Coupe du Monde féminine de 2014 et 2017. So please join us on Thursday, and then we will be going to once a week starting next week. Next Thursday, we will have another batch of webinars, and we will be promoting those shortly. So Jennifer, last word to you.
Thank you. And thank you guys, everybody. As Nathan said, I'm happy to connect. There's obviously so much involved with event management that we can talk about. So definitely I'm happy to have a conversation with you if you're interested in learning more about my perspective on things. And certainly I'm happy to share any resources or templates. So feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'll be happy to connect. And in terms of a philosophy, just be adaptable, be flexible. No matter how organized and well planned you are, there are going to be things that curveballs that come your way, and you just need to be able to adjust to that. And I certainly have a few stories about that I'm happy to share with anyone interested.
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.